Well, thank you everyone for coming in tonight. Zan mentioned last week, my what if and first dip into doing counterfactual history was La Cubana City. And to get a point of departure, I had to cancel I had to end the Cuban Revolution of 1896 early and the Spanish-American War. I'm not going to be doing that tonight. I thought about having to cancel World War II to get there, but I just decided that's too much. So we're really looking at small things tonight. And actually, tonight is going to be a little less alternate history than it was last week and more of how did we never get a roadshow building? Because I think looking back at the possibilities, if our history were to play out many times, in most instances, we would have ended up with one. Nonetheless, there's lots of things in our collections that always had me wondering if it had happened otherwise. A lot of them are really tiny. This is the initial architectural drawing of the Thomasville Municipal Building and Auditorium. If they did this, let's face it, the Thomasville's history would not be significantly different. I don't know, maybe someone falls down the stairs or something like that. A lot of them are kind of small, and then some of them are too big, at least for me to tackle in a reasonable amount of time. And in the 1850s, there was a group in Thomasville that was so frustrated with not getting a train, they wanted Thomas County to secede from Georgia and be annexed by Florida. Because Florida was building trains through Tallahassee and doing lots of state funding. That's too big of a question for me to answer, or at least in a half-hour talk anyway. But the roadshow building in Paradise Park kind of fits nicely in the middle. It doesn't change Thomasville's history in radical ways, but it does change some things, particularly, I think, the built environment and maybe how we think of downtown, even Thomasville's relationship to preservation. So first, we want to look back at how did we get to even thinking about a roadshow building, what actually happened. So 1922, 1923, the first roadshow shows took place at Neal's Department Store, which of course is at the corner of Broad and Jackson. First year was a bigger success than people thought. Second year was huge. I mean, way bigger than they thought. It was great for the business owners downtown, except for the Neal brothers. It wasn't great for them because they pretty much had to close because of the roadshow being in there. And they were not super psyched to be the only people missing out on a huge boom in sales. So they didn't want to do it for 1924. And so the Garden Club had to go around looking for someone else. And they ended up at McManus Buick on North Madison, about where Ponders is today. And it was another great one, well attended. I think the picture looks lovely. The Garden Club was not all in on it. They didn't like the idea of it being in a garage. Parking right where they were was a little bit of an issue, especially with more people coming every year. And so they decided they did not want it at the Buick dealership the next year. So in 25, they go to the brand new side school gymnasium. It fronted Washington Street. Great. Except now everyone was complaining it's too far of a walk to get downtown. Also, the school wasn't super excited of what a whole bunch of people in not in rubber-soled sneakers walking through the gymnasium, ruining the perfectly good brand new floor. So after 25, the East Side School gym was out also. Then we end up somewhere for at least a few years. The tobacco warehouse on the southwest corner of Hansel and Metcalf, right on the railroad tracks, where the Thomas County Mental Health Public Health Department is today. And hey, had a good run there over the course of a few years. There were still complaints about it being too far from downtown. There were complaints about people having trouble finding it, so they took an army of Boy Scouts that were standing in the middle of Smith Avenue directing people. Some people found this embarrassing. I find it charming, but that's me today. And they changed Smith Avenue to one way, and some people got really mad for the day, and some people got really mad about that. But nonetheless, it looked really nice, decorated, and it worked for a few years. But then by about 1930 or so, they were already talking about finding another place and started actually talking about needing a building. So they actually kind of did build a roadshow building out on Campbell Street, where Vos Field was basically where the industrial park is today. And there was plenty of parking. They had lots of time to decorate. There wasn't like issues over when they could get into the space. It was a huge building. But there were a lot of issues with people being able to get downtown business owners not being happy that there were some people setting up pop-up stands where they were selling food right at the location. And again, needing a army of Boy Scouts to direct people around. And so while you'd see it's not like it was far, but you know what? If you're walking and late April, early May can be pretty hot. Yeah, there were issues there too, but it did make it have a nice, decent run there up until 1941. In fact, by 1940, there was again a lot of talk about, hey, we need a place downtown, and a lot of people were looking at a 20-acre tract of virgin pine woods right in the Thomasville business district, just waiting to be used. So on October 10th, 1941, the Times Enterprise runs an article about the Garden Club is going to go all in on getting a permanent roadshow building just for the roadshow and county fairs and other purposes, but the real main purpose was going to be the roadshow. And a lot of people are saying that Paradise Park is the place to do it. Now, there's discussions going on today about Paradise Park. There were 20 years ago, and there were 20 years before then. And with any luck, there will be 20 years from now. It has been one of Thomasville's favorite topics of conversation of what will we do with Paradise Park. They ran over the next 2 weeks around 25 articles about it. People were writing in. Judge Hopkins, Truman Holland, who was the president of Commercial Bank, all write in and have their various viewpoints. Dr. Henry Moore was one of them, who was a very prominent doctor in town. His brother, Louis Moore, was a part of one of the big collections we have here. And Henry Moore was really against it. He was one of the people taking a stand against it. And in fact, there was a community of older citizens who remembered back to when the city bought it that were very much against the idea, but some were for it, including Interestingly, Judge Hawkins. Except he was very specific. He claimed to have been the person who told Judge Hansel to include the line in the deed that sold Paradise Park to the city that it must be for it perpetual use as a park and park purposes. And he said that that was the only reason the Smith family agreed to the deal. But he said, hey, you know what? There is one spot where the star is up there. He called it the Finn lot, named for John L. Finn, who was actually a son-in-law of Simeon Smith. And his take on it was that Finn sold the lot after the city already got the park, and there were actually no covenants on it. There was nothing preventing anything being built on that little lot up there, about acre and a half or somewhere around there. And so the Rose Show building should be built there. And it seemed like that might actually be a reasonable proposal. And he even said if you need to close up the section of Dawson Street, which cut through, that would be okay. And that made sense too, given that Metcalf Ave went straight through. There was no overpass yet, of course, so you could just use Metcalf instead. Lee Kelly, who was the publisher of the Fox Enterprise and the #1 proponent of building and overall developing Paradise Park, period, thought that it should be built in what he called the lower section, which was across from the AB&C Railroad Depot on the southeast corner of Dawson and Metcalf, or really Railroad. And he thought that would give the best access to everyone. Of course, there was a little problem of what does the phrasing park purposes mean? And I know this is like getting really into parsing words, but this is also the whole issue of doing things in Paradise Park to this very day, is that line of what does park purposes mean? And not surprisingly, there was a lot of disagreement about that. And then December 7th, 1941 happens, and everything gets put on hold. And that is not surprising. And I don't think there is any reality in which the building gets built either before World War II or through the beginning of it. I think because it was just in October that they started really talking about raising money. There's no way this happens by January. So they canceled the plans, and it's never mentioned ever again. Or this goes on another 30 years. So now we're at 1947, after the war, and Lee Kelly was salty about the building not being built. And he's bringing it up again, and he had a different thoughts about why the building never got built. Rather than point to wanting to put on things on hold for the war, it was because people didn't agree with each other. And he's not entirely wrong. People did disagree with each other. But that it is just as important to get back to it today. And talking about Thomasville being a mockery for our inertia and lack of vision. Oof, that's rough. Yeah, he was, but you know what happened shortly after this? The Garden Club goes over to the VA domiciliary, the former Finney General Hospital, and asks, can we use your gymnasium to do this next year? They, of course, say yes. So now any good counterfactual or alternate history needs a point of divergence from our history. And I think this makes the easiest point where the federal government says no for whatever reasons, maybe, I don't know, insurance, you can't use the building. And so now they need to do it somewhere else. And we'll get back to that. But first, the rest of trying to get this thing. Now we're on to 1957. And the Chamber of Commerce approaches the city of Thomasville and says, hey, remember that nice triangle of land right at Metcalf Avenue and Broad Street? I think we can build there. Can we have it? And can we build the Chamber of Commerce headquarters there? And they sure did. Carl Altman, who was the city attorney, reviewed all of the deeds and said, yes, you could go ahead and build in the triangle. And basically, within a little more than a year from the time this was announced, the Chamber of Commerce building was built and it was open. And I'm going to kind of get back to this when I talk about how people view what is Paradise Park. Because when people talk about where the Chamber of Commerce building is, they'll say it's on South Broad Street. I can't recall everyone saying, oh, the Chamber of Commerce building is in Paradise Park. Even though technically it is literally in Paradise Park. What changes what, I guess, is one of the questions. And yes, there was some people did complain and pointed out, but a lot of the people, including Dr. Moore and Judge Hopkins, who was supportive, and some of the other people who took issue with it had since passed away. And everyone else, 1957, was very busy with little kids. And there was no real super strong opposition to this. And so everything went forward. And this got Lee Kelly thinking again. Someone just built right where I wanted to build. We need to do something with Paradise Park. And he was pleased that they did it, but that now is the time and there's movement to really do something. So we had a plan. It was going to include playgrounds, horticulture exhibits, an amphitheater, a new municipal auditorium, and a roadshow pavilion. That sounds like a lot for about 20 acres, and still have a place for a park. But this is what was getting thrown out there. And then the next year, he has Prince Wright draw this plan up. Chamber gets behind it. And again, a lot of talk about it. And now there's actually a drawing of a building. And what a building it was. The idea of it would be along Metcalf Avenue. And the reason being was that they thought it would give the greatest access from Broad and Hansel, having it on Metcalf, and that there would be the most parking on Metcalf. He suggested the price would be $250,000 and $1960. So there was a pretty good fee. And for our interests here, he said that it would be the home of the relatively recently formed Thomas County Historical Society to put a museum in. And so thinking about alternatives, that is one of the places that we could have been out of a number of suggestions over the years. But this one, hey, being a fairly realistic one. And yes, giving a good rundown and had a lot of ideas of what it would do for Thomasville. There's the Plantation Museum and a room for the Historical Society. So I guess two museums in there. which would have been interesting over the years. So from 1960 to 1964, Kelly advocated for this, and to a lesser degree, the chamber in general. But this was really Lee, but really having Ed Kelly, his son, who had pretty much taken over running the newspaper, doing it. I think the price tag probably made a lot of people nervous. 1964, he goes ahead and reruns the exact same article, makes the same argument. And that was really the last mention and the last stand for there being a roadshow bill. I think they checked that, like at that point, it was okay, this isn't happening, and no one really took up the mantle. I'm sure that it had been mentioned, particularly when they were building over at the fairgrounds. There seemed to be some talk about would the building at the Exchange Club Fairgrounds be big enough to have the row show in, but it was never a central feature again after that. And there goes the UFO off to space. So now I'm interested in what would Paradise Park look like today if they did go ahead and build a roadshow building in Paradise Park. We're going to start off with the first possibility, which was, say, in 1947, the federal government says you can't use the VA. Everyone gets behind building a building over in the Triangle. Now, the first thing I wondered was, what would this building look like built in 47, 48? And there would have been a lot of pressure to keep down, to have something sturdy. I basically ended up at what the original Jurger School looked like. You would have needed something probably in the 9,000, 7,000 square foot range, multi-use, and it was a popular building style then. So I envisioned the main part and then, two wings coming off of it. Maybe they would have gone else. My other thought was like miniature one-story municipal building was the other thought that I had, but that probably would have cost too much at that. So we have the Roadshow building here, and opened by 1948, and that's the year the Rose starts, with a parade and pageant and all the other things that people actually think of when they think of the Rose Show now, and not the actual Rose Show. And I think that they would all continue on basically the way that they did. But now everything is going on around Paradise Park. Parade probably goes south down Broad Street, ends in the park. And parking is a really big deal. Like, it's getting bad, say, by 1950, 51, when it really starts to be a huge event. And I don't see any way in the world that they avoid, for public safety reasons, having to basically clear out the northwest end of the park for parking lot, and probably realistically 7 to 10 acres. Now, I don't think it would have been paved at first, but I think there would have been a lot of pressure to pave it within a few years. And also, once you use something like public safety to go ahead and break sort of this thing, it's probably not the last time it happens. In fact, it's not hard to kind of project that traffic coming out of the parking lot right onto South Dawson and then Metcalf and South Broad Street would be a hot mess. Cars would be backed up a lot, people would be complaining, and something would need to be done about it. And so I think that, well, Rose Drive will pop in a minute, that whether they did it at the Triangle or over here on Metcalf Ave, that you would end up with Rose Drive, or something equivalently named York Street, something along those lines, where you have an alternative exit out of the park for cars parking. And now Paradise Park is bifurcated. The rest of Paradise Park now, you're talking 12 acres left, and maybe that 12 acres gets left untouched, but I also kind of highly doubt that. Now, look at the third option, which is the Pavilion. It was going to be a much bigger building, and there were already plans for paving around it. So we're talking about a parking lot. Also, because it was bigger, instead of extending Neil Drive through the park, they'd probably do it from what was Satius Street, today Victoria Place. And now you're looking at a scenario where there's maybe only 7 or 8 acres left of the original Paradise Park. Because realistically, parking could expand easily. Now I'm going to move on to some more details. I do think they would have put a rose garden in there. That would have been there. And hey, that's, I think that would have been okay. I don't know if the swimming pool, the municipal auditorium, and the amphitheater all would have been built there. But you are still left with a park that was cut in half, and also kind of wondering how it affects development around it, in that I don't think they still build the underpass over on Hansel Street anymore. They would have had to, because several times a year, especially if they ended up doing fairs there on a regular basis and having other events, concerts, that would have been tough to not have that Metcalf Avenue exit. So I'm kind of thinking either they would have gone under the railroad, like in the middle of the park by the, like into where the shopping center was built a few years later. Or they do it at Broad and Jackson, which still isn't a terrible idea, but there were also reasons why they didn't do it to begin with. I also think the other big effect is that Hansel and Broad across from the park become much less attractive to live when there is a commercial area with so much activity going on, and there being so much more noise pollution, people parking on your front yard. And by the 70s, there was periods where that area of Hansel became fairly run down. They were talking about actually this landmarks in the mid 70s had stepped in and bought a bunch of houses on Hansel Street, the 400 block, to prevent it from becoming a shopping center. So even without that, some stuff almost happened, but I think we would be looking at a completely commercial district on Hansel and South Broad over there, if the building was ever built. Of course, maybe it would be a whole lot lively too. That's the other part of it, and certainly some businesses would have been very happy and had a lot of success from having it downtown. So it's not all negative outcomes, but certainly for preservation, I think it wouldn't be natural preservation. And now our last look. That was the 61. This is the original plan. I think probably a little bit less of an impact on the park itself. And because there was sort of more modest goals from this, it's something that could have worked if it stayed in the triangle. I still think you end up with a smaller Paradise Park, but with less of a impactful development footprint altogether. But of course, there's a lot of possibilities from these type of things. Maybe it's a wild success. Maybe we're all working in there today. Um, then there's the other sort of dire scenario, which is maybe the whole thing gets paved over eventually. Once the House of Cards starts coming down, and there basically just is no Paradise Park in, which I think also is a reasonably likely scenario from the whole thing. Thinking about how we think of where the chamber is and that we just don't think of it as Paradise Park anymore, I think wherever the Rose Show Pavilion ended up, we eventually would have just stopped thinking of that as Paradise Park. It would have been the Rose Show lot or block, and whatever is left is what would have been thought of. So there is the story, and thank you everyone for coming. And if anyone would like to contribute any memories, ideas of how this would have played out, I'd love to hear it.